Illegal crossings along the U.S. southern border are on the rise again, 3 months after the Biden administration issued new asylum restrictions. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. More than 130,000 migrants were apprehended at the U.S. Mexico border in July, according to data obtained by the Washington Post. That's a 30% increase from June. Authorities say smugglers are using different routes to avoid detection, including the Arizona desert, where record high temperatures have made the journey extremely dangerous. Excuse me. The Biden administration implemented new measures in May that require migrants to apply for asylum in other countries before reaching the United States. Anyone who enters the U.S. illegally can be deported and barred for 5 years. The policy is now being challenged in the courts. For more on the U.S. asylum restrictions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Managua, Nicaragua, is Benjamin Norton. He's an investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. From Austin, Texas, Kate Lincoln Goldfinch is an immigration attorney. Also with us from Mexico City, Laura Carlson is the director of the Americas program, and Ariel Ruiz Soto is a senior policy analyst with the Migration Policy Institute in Sacramento, California. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Ariel, let me start with you. So President Biden ended this policy known as Title 42 in May. That's a measure that was meant to address public health issues to prevent the spread of infections, of disease. But now the Biden administration has issued new restrictions that disqualify migrants from seeking asylum if they enter the United States illegally. And in fact, one of the courts has agreed with Biden. They've upheld those restrictions, keep the measures in place for now. How does this policy work, the new policy, and why are some calling it a human rights violation?
Well, to be clear, the Circumvent for Legal Pathways rule that was announced in May and implemented after Title 42 ended is meant to try to channel migrants to ports of entry along the U.S. Mexico border. And what this means is that the administration is trying to allow for that process to become orderly. Clearly, trying to do this by making migrants go to ports of entry when the capacity may be limited has been seen and criticized by many in trying to reduce their access to asylum, which in many cases does extend that period for migrants to wait in Mexico. In particular, this change in the asylum considerations means that migrants have to prove that they either have a CBP-1 appointment to enter a port of entry and then come into the United States to later then seek asylum, or that they applied for asylum, let's say in Mexico or another country, and that they were denied, so they can then later on be able to pass that criteria. Obviously, in clear terms, many migrants who before thought that they could make it and then between ports of entry to be able to seek asylum are now having a more difficult time, especially given the different restrictions and currently the timing. This has had very clear impacts, not just for migrants, I should say, but also for the communities where migrants are being received. In this particular case, the courts have said they could continue, as you mentioned, but it is likely that this will continue to be litigated and potentially, in the end, may have a different outcome.
So, Ariel, in effect, is it almost the same as Title 42?
Well, not necessarily. Title 42 meant that it allowed people to be, once they enter between ports of entry, particularly, they were being expelled to Mexico very quickly. But under Title 42 terms, even when the levels were highest, the people that were initially being put into Title 42 proceedings were actually Mexicans and Central Americans. Most Venezuelans and Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans were actually allowed to be processed in the United States and potentially released thereafter. What this new policy does is it also applies this new rule to other migrants and makes it more difficult for them to access asylum between ports of entry.
Okay. Laura, under an agreement with the United States, Mexico is now accepting migrants who've been turned away by the United States. How is Mexico managing this, and what kind of impact is this policy having?
Very badly. There are more than 100,000 people stuck on the border between people who have been returned and people who are waiting for appointments or waiting to cross into the United States. It isn't even like what we call a third safe country agreement, which is where there's some financial compensation for the fact that basically you're receiving asylum seekers to another country. These people want to go to the United States. Some of them are waiting to go through the legal pathways to the United States, and yet Mexico is forced to receive them. There isn't financial compensation for this. There's not the infrastructure on the border to be able to take care of these people. And Mexico has also been forced to take on this punitive contention model of dealing with migratory flows, primarily from Central America, but now, as you mentioned, we're seeing many other countries as well, which means that there's been the deployment of armed forces and police forces throughout the country to cut off the migratory flows. What happens then with both countries taking this approach is that there's the denial of asylum rights. International asylum law says that anyone can enter into a country when they're unsafe and make the case about why they can't go back to their country and why they need to seek safety in this country. And it says nothing about this being a port of entry. So that was one of the bases for them striking down the application of Title VIII, because it says that anybody who crosses into a port of entry, outside of a port of entry, whether they have an asylum case or not, will not even be heard. So what the Biden administration has done is to increase expedited deportations and deny asylum rights to a large number of people. And Mexico has been helping with this policy. And the end result is that the migrants who are accumulating on the border, who are fleeing countries where they really are in unsafe conditions, are in very unsafe conditions. They're prey to organized crime in the border areas. There isn't housing, there aren't jobs, because they haven't been given papers or a legal status in Mexico for the most part. And meanwhile, on the whole trip through Mexico, they're prey to corrupt immigration officials and to organized crime and to being captured and rapidly deported back to their home countries.
Benjamin, if we look at the situation right now, there's more than 2 million people who have left the Northern Triangle countries, as it's called. That's Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing corruption. And in many instances, I mean, part of this is happening because the United States, and people have criticized the United States for this, the United States has been funding corrupt governments in this particular region. To what extent is the U.S. government and its policies responsible for what we're seeing at the border?
Well, this is a crucial factor that is not discussed enough in much of the media reporting on the migration from Central America. Honduras is a perfect example. In 2009, there was a military coup that overthrew Honduras' democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, and the United States completely gave the green light to that coup. Then the Obama administration supported the coup, and subsequently the Trump administration continued supporting a series of corrupt governments that were very credibly accused of rigging elections. The situation has finally been changing in Honduras. There is a new progressive government that is trying to reverse many of the policies. But in that period of more than a decade following the military coup, Honduras became one of the most dangerous countries on earth, with one of the highest homicide rates on earth. So it was no surprise that there was a massive exodus of Hondurans simply seeking peace. I mean, poverty is already brutal enough. Central America is one of the poorest regions in the world. Outside of Haiti, it's the poorest area in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. So many people already they have a financial interest in going abroad in search of better paying jobs so they can send back money to their families. But I really think we should emphasize the role of insecurity and violence. The situation has been slightly changing in El Salvador, largely because the President Bukele has just decided to lock up huge amounts of people. Anyone even remotely linked to drug gangs or criminal activity has just been completely locked up without due process. But the point is that this is a region where the United States has a long history of supporting unpopular governments, of backing violence in the case of Nicaragua in the 1980s. And I will say that the country in the region where the United States has the least relations, which is Nicaragua, actually is the safest country in the region. I mean, Costa Rica is a very close U.S. ally, and there's been a rise in violence and crime. But Insight Crime, which is a crime watchdog, just published a report looking at data from last year and found that in all of the Americas, in fact, Nicaragua has the second lowest homicide rate, excluding Chile, which came in first place. So the reality is that basically the closer a government like Guatemala is, for instance, to the U.S., the more likely there is to be mass migration and corruption and violence in many of these countries.
Kate, let me ask you first about these measures that the Biden administration announced after it ended the Title 42 policy. I mean, initially it was rejected by a court, then another court said that it can stay in place for now. What happens next?
I think ultimately, like Laura said, this law will not stand as it makes its way through the courts because it is in violation of international asylum and refugee law, which has been on our books since 1980. It was passed by Congress, and in the definition, it says that it doesn't matter how someone got into the United States, but that they have to be here in order to apply for asylum. And so this policy that says that if you didn't, wait your turn with the CBP-1 app, it's in contradiction to a law that Congress has passed. In practice, it's really horrific. What happens is, as the other panelists have mentioned, a lot of these migrants and refugees, they're coming to the U.S. border. They are refugees in Mexico, and they are subjected to all sorts of violence while they await their turn. And right now, for the people who can figure out how to use the app, it takes at least 2 months for them to even get to the point where they might be processed. And I can tell you, as an immigration lawyer in Texas for 15 years, I've been through previous administrations. I've worked with thousands of asylum seekers, and we've had functioning systems in place pre-Title 42, pre-Trump, pre-COVID, where an asylum seeker could simply come to the border. They could walk across the bridge and they could say, I'm afraid of returning to my country. And they would be temporarily detained and put through a credible fear interview screening. And not everyone qualified. The people who didn't were sent home, but the people who did qualify were admitted, and they would prepare for their final hearing. And that was a functional, mostly dignified, mostly orderly process that overall wasn't broken. But we tore apart that whole system, stopped asylum processing at the borders for 3 years, and now Biden's sort of sneaking us back, but it's not going to work until we get back to where we were.
Right, and Kate, there's one other case, and that is the Department of Justice is taking the state of Texas to court over a barrier that it's placed in the middle of the Rio Grande River to block migrants from crossing the river. In fact, one of the migrants was caught in the barrier, and the body of a child was recovered upstream. And we're looking at pictures of them crossing the river right now. I mean, how will that case play out in court?
Ultimately, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is going to be found to be violating federal and international laws. He doesn't have the jurisdiction to go into the waters and place these buoys. There's obvious humanitarian concerns with his actions, but there's also major legal problems with what he's doing. And so he's spent over $10 billion of Texan taxpayer money in his Operation Lone Star, which has resulted in fewer than 1% of the apprehension. So it's been a failed result, even with all that money spent. And now he's doubling down and going into court, spending more Texan taxpayer money. And ultimately, he will not succeed. He doesn't have a strong legal position.
Laura, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he has condemned that floating barrier and he wants it removed. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Es inhumano.
It's inhumane. You don't treat any person like that. No one should be treated like that. That's not something good people do.
Now, Laura, there was a U.S. government survey that was done on this barrier, and it found that 80% of the barrier is technically actually in Mexico. So can López Obrador actually remove this barrier himself?
Well, it's not clear if he would go so far as to try to remove it himself, but Mexico has already presented 2 diplomatic notes in protest of the barrier. They've set an inspection team up as well, and they've protested in terms of the humanitarian concerns, which are obvious. 2 people dead already. I mean, it's barbaric. It's utterly barbaric. But they've also protested because it's in violation of the International Boundary and Waters Commission agreement, and saying that the heavy equipment that they took in, the way that these buoys are fastened to the river floor, it's already changed the boundaries of the water, and so they're waiting to see what comes out of that. But there are a million reasons, as Kate says, for which this was a highly illegal activity. But we know that the purpose of it is political. We're coming into an election period, and I think one of the biggest concerns now in Mexico is these draconian measures against migrants, and even the very strict measures that are following basically the same model on the part of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration are going to get worse as they begin to vie on who can look to be tougher on cracking down on migrants. So it's a very dangerous situation, both politically and, of course, physically, for people who are going to the United States. And meanwhile, conditions are not improving in Central America rapidly, and there's still many, many reasons why people find themselves forced to migrate and to go up to the United States.
Ariel, unlawful crossings at that border, they fell to their lowest level in June, but they went up again in July. Border Patrol agents say there's also increased traffic across the Arizona desert, and this is a very harsh route for people to take because of heat, very high temperatures. What can you tell us about the people taking this route and why it's being used right now by smuggling gangs?
Well, clearly there's many factors that affect how migrants try to arrive at the U.S. Mexico border, but you're right. We have seen an increase in Tucson sector where there's been an important number of families, Mexicans, primarily Mexican, but also Central American families coming to this part of the border. And sometimes that's meant because smugglers have found different ways to try to cross fencing or other pathways. Sometimes it is because on the Mexican side of the territory, the different drug and other narco traffickers are now moving and shifting the places where people can enter and move through that part of the border. But also it has to do with the changes in policies across other sectors. For example, we've seen that Yuma, also in Arizona, has seen a steady and a small, in some cases, a small decrease, which means that more people are moving from that sector potentially to the one in Tucson. But overall, the people that pass through this, especially in Arizona, where the desert and the temperature can be so hot, actually puts them in significant danger. And again, for many of these families with children, particularly vulnerable to heat and other different measures, animals and everything else, makes it even more complicated. We've seen that these are changes that have continued across other parts of the border too. In Brownsville and near the Gulf of Mexico, we've seen too some increases because primarily Honduran and Guatemalans have also shown to have increased in this last month of July.
Benjamin, we've also seen a record number of Nicaraguans enter the United States last year. Officials say 163,000 were granted asylum here in the United States. What's behind that huge movement of people from Nicaragua?
Well, we shouldn't exaggerate the number of Nicaraguans that have migrated. The biggest contributor by far has been from the countries in the Northern Triangle, especially Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But since 2018, there has been an increase, and this is because the United States has deeply politicized the issue of immigration from Nicaragua, which is very different from immigration of a country like Honduras or Guatemala, where many migrants are fleeing violence. In the case of Nicaragua, basically the United States has been sending out messages. I mean, the State Department is constantly releasing statements. There are advertisements on social media saying basically, come to the United States and you can say that you're basically a political asylee, because the United States has taken a very aggressive policy against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. This is not new. This goes back to the 1980s when the CIA backed a terror war through the Contras, and the International Court of Justice found the United States guilty of violating international law and committing acts of aggression, and the U.S. still refuses to this day to pay reparations to Nicaragua, which it legally owes. But the point is that the United States has continued this very aggressive policy, imposing sanctions on Nicaragua. In 2018, there was a very violent coup attempt, just similar to the coup attempt in Venezuela the next year with Juan Guaido and all of that the Trump administration did. What happened in Nicaragua is not as well known, but since then, the United States, not just Trump, the Biden administration has politicized this issue. Biden himself gave a speech claiming that migrants from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are victims of communism, and the U.S. should welcome them because they're fleeing communism. And then Biden's White House press secretary said the exact same thing. She said that these are victims of communism who are fleeing communism. So we see this very conservative rhetoric that you would expect from Republicans, but the Democrats are also using it and essentially encouraging large numbers of people to leave these countries, politicizing this issue. But again, I mean, we should consider it in comparison to the significantly larger numbers of migrants who have left the northern neighbors of Nicaragua, of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala over the past decade, who have been actually fleeing extreme violence. So again, I think it's important to separate the politicization of that from the material conditions. Again, a study from looking at homicide rates from last year actually found that Nicaragua has the second lowest homicide rates in all of Latin America. So people are not fleeing violence.
Kate, I want to talk about how Texas is handling the large number of people who've crossed the border into the state. But one other question, and that is, what, under the current rules, what happens to people who are already in the United States? They have crossed the border. Can they still seek asylum here?
Sure. If they've been processed in, once they get into the interior of the United States, maybe they passed a credible fear interview at the border and they were processed in, or they're in the interior, they can apply for asylum. They might either be in removal proceedings if they were apprehended and allowed in which case they prepare for their final hearing before an immigration judge, and they have to put on testimony and evidence and maybe witnesses, maybe an expert. They'll be cross-examined by a Department of Homeland Security attorney. It's quite a rigorous process, and it can take, months to years depending upon the court schedule. They may be eligible to apply for work permission about 5 months after they file for asylum. And so, and what we find through multiple studies is that asylum seekers who are processed in that manner, more than 90%, often 95+% of them actually do prepare and show up for their final asylum hearings because they are incentivized to do that. So there is some rhetoric out there that once an asylum seeker comes into the United States that they abscond, and that is not what the data shows.
Right, and you were talking about the Texas governor earlier on, Greg Abbott. Now, something that he has done, and I should say that he's Republican, he has bussed up to 30,000 migrants to Democrat-run cities in the United States, cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, and the city of New York. Now, the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, has criticized the Biden administration policies. Let's listen to what the New York mayor had to say.
We are facing an unprecedented state of emergency. The immigration system in this nation is broken. It has been broken for decades. Today, New York City has been left to pick up the pieces. Since last year, nearly 100,000 asylum seekers have arrived in our city asking for shelter.
So, Kate, New York also says that this is costing the city something like $12 billion. But what do we know of the fate of those who were bussed up to these cities?
Well, the way this has worked, and we've seen a lot of these sort of political stunts where, Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis will bus or even fly migrants up to DC, New York, et cetera. And the whole point is to bring migrants from where they are, where they most often, in my experience, have a plan. They have somewhere to go. They may have a brother in Houston or a sister in Maryland or somewhere to go, but they're taken instead by bus to some other location where their cell phone dies en route, and they're dumped at some civic center in some city that they never intended to be in. And then it looks like there is this chaos and this influx, and that's the whole point. And there is a lot of political and media attention for the governors who are engaging in these activities, and it makes the appearance of the migrant issue look like it is overwhelmed and overrun. What I have seen in the past working with my clients is that once they're processed in, typically they're at, border cities where there is infrastructure in place. There are NGOs and other groups and entities who can help get people, to the Greyhound bus station to go where they intended to go. And it looks very different than what we're seeing right now.
Right. Ariel, there's also a massive backlog of immigration cases in United States courts. In fact, there has been research done. Researchers at Syracuse University in New York say about 650 judges carry a backlog of more than 2.4 million cases. So what does this mean for asylum seekers?
Well, I think the previous panelists were just talking about this issue. One of the key things that happens right now in our current asylum process is that it could take years for a person to be, once they begin their asylum hearing, to actually be able to complete their asylum case. And so what this means is that most people, or many people that apply for asylum once they're in the United States, actually take a very long time for them to be able to have security and safety, whether they will be able to stay in the country or whether they will potentially be returned to their country of origin. The issue is really bigger than any one administration. The immigration judges and the asylum courts have been backlogged for years. And in this case, it means that many judges have hundreds of people in their caseload for them to be able to decide. And realistically, the people that are arriving currently at the U.S. Mexico border, for example, may have a court hearing that is scheduled until a couple of years from now for them to begin their cases. Of course, for many of these migrants, it's important that they can be able to work once they begin to have that asylum process hearing. But for many of them, living with uncertainty about what will happen to them can actually be a significant pressure. And what potentially could ease some of this type of backlogs is to be able to provide better assistance and additional resources so that immigration courts have more judges, are able to screen those cases more quickly, but also that some of that screening begins earlier on at the U.S. Mexico border, which has been tried, but only in small cases and for a very particular number of people.
Okay, Laura, President Biden traveled to Mexico. He had a meeting with President López Obrador there. What came out of that meeting on this immigration issue? And I'm sorry, we only have a few seconds left.
Well, we often don't know what exactly comes out of it because most of these agreements are not formal. There will be continued collaboration on the immigration issue, and what they're trying to work on is what they call the root causes, which means more funding to Central America from both Mexican and U.S. governments and more funding to southern Mexico as well to be able to give jobs and to be able to reduce the amount of forced migration, people having to leave because they have no other opportunities. What we have to do is change the whole paradigm. We talk about this in emergency as if these were feral dogs being let loose in suburbia. These are human beings. They contribute more to economies than they cost, except for the ridiculous cost, both political and economic, of the measures, inhumane measures taken to keep them out.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.